Thank you for joining us for Prep Talks. This is going to be our second talk. It will be with Vinita Agarwal, Associate Professor of Communication at Salisbury University, where she teaches on strategic communication and researches patient-provider communication and therapeutic relationships. And she'll be telling us about formatting your CV.
Good morning, everyone, and it's good to have you all here on this very noisy morning. I hope you can all hear me. I think the sound goes through. So the talk today is on how to write and maintain your CV, but before I get to that, I feel like this image spoke to me as I was preparing the talk of the unique challenges that we are faced with when we think about writing our CV, and especially our first CVs as we are getting on the job market, but even more so down the line as we apply for our first jobs, go up for tenure, and down the trajectory. So the talk basically is going to center on how to write and maintain an academic CV, and I'm going to try to balance this in two sides, aspects of the challenges here, one being how would you write it, the other being how do you structure it, how do you organize it, and who is it going towards, because I think at the very beginning and at the onset, it needs to be said that a CV is not a static document. Just as you're not a static individual, it's a narrative of your life. It's a narrative of your life where you are today, but it also tells a narrative of where you're trying to head at whatever stage of your career and your job search or your promotion or your trajectory you're on. So these tensions really bear balancing in thinking about your CV, and I'm going to try and center these as I do the talk. So to start with, I thought what we kind of miss is the basics. And part of the basics is thinking about how do we start to think about the word CV? And the curriculum vitae actually comes from the Latin word which means a story of your life or an accounting of who you are and where you're going. So that's going to be a good groundwork to keep in mind as you think about your CV. So this talk is very much structured as a series of conversations along this way, and if you have any questions, you can definitely raise your hand in the middle, or we can wait till the end for those kind of questions as well. The two parts out here that I have are thinking about how you tell the story of your life, but then thinking about the CV as a strategic document. So where is it headed, and to what extent are you trying to provide this sort of information, balancing information, comprehensiveness, but also a sort of strategic telling. It all helps to think in terms of when you're thinking in terms of organizing it and the structure of the CV, to think in terms of how it's positioning you at the center of the story with respect to who it's going towards and where it's facing. And when I say where it's facing, it means you could be putting it up online, it could be shared in a different format, or it could be going as a very formal document as part of your teaching evaluation, so your promotion or your first job application. So balancing structure and the narrative with respect to the information that you've got is going to be paramount as you start to think about your unique personal CV. So the CV as a large, as the whole document has about 5 elements, and think about it as having these as the 5 building blocks of telling the story of where you're coming from, who you are in the present, and where you're headed. So the first section is the personal section, and the second section is these are the structural guidelines which are given to you in terms of the format. So education, and there's research and teaching, and there's a little bit of flexibility here. If you think in terms of whether teaching should come first or whether research should come first, and we'll talk about that later. And then the last is the service. So let's start with the first one, which is personal. And I'm going to play a little bit here with respect to how we might start to even formatting it and center it in how we do it here in the US for academic jobs. And so most of the formatting, when we think about, we want to keep it uncluttered despite whatever amount of information you're putting there. So it's easily accessible by whoever is receiving your CV. So having things like main headings, subheadings, subheadings, and these are balanced out with respect to formatting pointers like bold or underline or capitals, kind of helps a bit. You don't want to be too ornate with your formatting, and this is something you want to think about early on as you start to structure your CV, to see how you might want to put the look of it and what things will go in the headings as in a centered, what would go in terms of subheadings, and what might go as subheadings as the minor categories in your CV. It also helps to have some amount of white space in between these categories with respect to your formatting, so as to not have a very cluttered CV where your different categories and subheadings get missed out, but also to be able to keep it accessible and flowing. Font size, typically these are basics, I just want to get them out of the way. Keep it to about 12 or 11 font, sans serif or serif usually works well, translates well on the other side as well. So thinking through these structures helps you organize the basic building blocks, and then you can play within those building blocks as your CV gets developed or sent out to different places. So the first aspect I have up here is your personal aspect. What would you put in your personal aspect is really the point to think about here is who you are and what represents your basic contact information and how you can be reached. So think about this one in two basic categories, the way I've split it up over here, contact information, and I've put a certain formatting category, the header, over here as well. But the header is basically going to be continuing throughout your document. So you may not have it on the first page, but you may have it starting the second page onwards, and that's your last name and your page number to keep continuity on the CV. The personal information is very standard. So this is the part where your structure comes into play, and it's pretty much what you would say where your name and where what your qualifications are. So if you're a Ph.D. candidate, you put that. If you're a Ph.D., you put that. Over there, your designation and your institution's names. The postal address is typically still used as a full address, your snail mail address as a large format, complete with the zip code. So the whole thing there. Email, cell phone, I haven't got it up here, but the departmental fax is also a good thing to have here. Even if you're a grad student, you might use your department's fax information. Now, these are not typically used. You don't expect people to be sending you a fax at your departmental address, but it's protocol, and we still go with that protocol in the CV. Something that's a little new is putting in any websites that you have, any content platforms which you feel represent where you are, what your scholarship might be, what you've taught, portfolios from your students, teaching evaluations, work you've done. Any of those comments, if you've got up on a content platform like a website or a Twitter feed, you might include those handles over here. Those make sense, LinkedIn accounts, but if you don't have a very professional one, or it's not up to date and not well maintained at the time when you're sending it out, I would recommend leaving it out. So check that you have a professional handle and it's serving your CV well as a backup if you include this information at the end. So that is the personal information part, and this would be fairly static to the extent that it doesn't change too much. The second aspect is your profile, which talks a little bit about where you are in terms of what you've done, so your credentials and your education, and what you're doing in terms of your appointments and where you've held positions. Education is degrees and your professional qualifications essentially. So there's a slight distinguishing angle between these two, so I decided to split it up. Degrees are your formal degrees, so like your bachelor's, your master's, your PhD, and those go there along with your institution's name, and your, let me pull the slide up as well, your institution's name and its, and your, if you're a PhD candidate, then your advisor's name and the dissertation topic, they're all good things to have up there. Your master's thesis title as well, and advisor's name is good to have up there too in your dissertation, in your CV at this point. People do say if you did an honors thesis in your undergraduate years, would you want to have that up there? Probably not, but master's onwards, definitely, whatever represents your professional trajectory. Some people might wonder if you want to have your committee members up there as well. That's a good question. I think the big concern to keep in mind here is, does it represent where you might be heading for a job? How does it represent where you might be, how you might be seen professionally, and whether it does justice to your dissertation's different aspects, and it speaks to a different angle that your dissertation is bringing in. So by all means, definitely have it up there if you are looking at that part of it. I have a little formatting tip up there, and that's how would you go about putting the structure on your on your different degrees and your appointments. The trouble here is that as you start to put your as you start to get your the different rows here and adding in the different material, it becomes a pain if things start to shift each time you have to add something in and take something out, and it starts to look very unprofessional, or it takes up a lot of your time. So one of the good easy tips over here is to think in terms of putting a table and inserting a table, which I think most of us know how to do, but I have a small table up there where you go with insert table, put in names, rows, columns. You basically want about 2 columns, about 5 to 7 rows over there in terms of technicalities, if you want to think about it. Now these are, you don't want the lines showing, so think APA style and make it all, you want to make it invisible in terms of the lines, so hide the lines over there. So that's the degrees, and professional qualifications may be any aspects that you would find that can be part of what you've got, like in terms of if you've taken extra qualifications for your, that serve towards your degree, in terms of if you're doing some sort of licensures or any kind of credentials that might go up there as well. The second is appointments, and appointments is I've split it under 3 categories here. So what you did in your graduate program is valid to have over here. What you did in your tenure track would be helpful to have over here. And also what you do if you're a mid-career professional would be good to have over here as well. So if you're in your graduate studies and you're in your first time on the job market, then you're thinking in terms of having anything that you've done in terms of teaching assistantships, research assistantships, as a graduate lecturer, any kind of positions that you've had at labs, all of those are good here. When you're on the tenure track, obviously you can put in things that you've done to get to the tenure track. So if you've been if you've gone through a path as an assistant professor at various places, any kind of designations you've held, whether they were as a term or as an adjunct or as a professor coming into the position, put them all up there. Mid-career professionals probably always wonder in terms of if you've got things like affiliate faculty, or if you're a visiting professor somewhere, those might be things that you would put over there. So those are all aspects that you come under appointments right after your education. The third part is where you think about your research and teaching. Here's, I think, the way people think about, if I'm applying to a teaching institution, should I have teaching up front or should I have the research up front? And if I'm applying to an R1, should I have the research up front or the teaching up front? With an R1, it's a no-brainer, so to speak. You would have your research up front. With the teaching institution too, I would suggest lean towards having the research up front, because the standard protocol when search committees look for applicants is to look for teaching when it comes out, whenever in the order of things. So it's not likely to get missed, and nobody is under the assumption that just because you put the research first, most likely that you're not attending to the teaching aspect of it. Research is valued, so go ahead and do what you're doing and put that up front along with your teaching later. So with that in mind, I'm going to go with the research first and think about how you might think about organizing your research categories here. So you're looking at publications and any kinds of grants you've received in your research category here. And think in these in terms of the larger overarching framework to think about these would be in terms of what is their credibility, what is their ranking, what is how are they evaluated on a competitive scale. So keep that at the back of your mind as you assess what you should be putting in there and how it should be organized. I've put this down as two ways, so you might think about it in terms of institutional and peer-reviewed. Institutional, you have two categories. If you've received any grants, that comes under one. Start plugging those in. If you've received any recognition, you put that under another heading. So the larger heading here is research, and then the subheadings here could be grants, recognition or honors and awards, and then publication. So look at the third row down there. So those might be journals, peer-reviewed publications, books, conference submissions, presentations, competitively reviewed, and things in press. So starting from the leftmost, if you look at the grants part of it, you think about grants in both ways. You could, I typically tend to make it another subcategory. If there are external grants, put them under external and then internal. With external, I think a quandary that people sort of face sometimes is if you've applied for grants but not received one, should that go in your CV? I think a big consideration for you to keep in mind here is that applying for grants it's a full-time, it's a worthy endeavor in itself. And it's especially if you're a new PhD on the market, just not having gotten a grant is not reason enough to not have it on your CV. It shows your motivation and your drive and your focus towards applying for a grant and which institution you applied for and what topic you went with and what kind of grant you sought. So it speaks a lot towards your focus and your goal and where you see yourself heading. And by that yardstick, it merits being in there. It tells the search committees on the other side that you have been doing this alongside the other aspects in your resume. So external grants, if you've applied, you might say the agency you've applied to, what type of grant, what was the title of the grant, the amount you sought. And then next to that, you can put down whether it was funded or not funded and what stage it is in, if it got peer reviewed. Some of the grants that are ranked, if you put in the ranking as well, that's fine too. If you got a rank on that, you can still put it, even if you didn't get funded. The underlying rationale is that all these items speak towards your efforts and they build towards a picture towards your larger narrative. It's not in access in terms of what should go into your grant and what should be in the CV. That's not exactly public facing. So this is worthy information to have there. Internal grants as well, I've struggled with saying, well, what are the grants that are too small to go in there? And what are the ones that might merit being there? You don't want your CV to look like a lot of filler, pumped up CV as well. And I have to say, this is still a little bit of a debate. So some of the grants that are, let's say, very small and they come up every semester and you're still going for them, I would put them under a subcategory and then just put the timeline of when you've received those. So they don't take up a whole line in your CV each time you receive that, but they're still there and they show that you are an active scholar or an active applicant for these kind of sources. Also, they tend to show that you're being supported by your institution, and that's good as well for you and for your institution as well. So internal grants, you might put the source and the topic or whatever goal they were funded for. After that is recognition, so honors and awards, whatever honors you've received, you put the title of the honor you've received and on the same row, the kind of honor you received it for. The awards you've received and the title of the awards you've received. After that, when you have the publications, is where people start to wonder what should be the order of these publications and what kind of information should go in there and how much is, again, too much over here, and what should be stuff that can be in your private resume, which is not really going in to help you keep track, and what should be things that can be actually sent out. So these are generally the questions that you're faced with when you look at the publications part of it. Journals are very competitive, and so they're peer-reviewed journals especially. You might put them up front. If you have a research monograph, on the other hand, you might start with the books section and put the research monograph there. So journals peer-reviewed, and the journals cite them in APA style when you're putting it up there. and obviously reverse chronological order, so simple, straightforward in all of these items. Books, if you have monographs, even if they are in a proposal stage or you're putting in something right now that's under revision, all of those are good items to have over there. Edited collections, if you're working on one, if you submitted, or even if you have a proposal that's under development, that's good to have as well. Chapters, if you booked, yes. Yes, APA style for sure for all of these, absolutely. And keep those consistent throughout the resume. And I say APA simply because our discipline takes APA, so we want to stick with a consistent style with that. Book chapters can come later. So books, if you have a whole monograph or an edited collection, makes sense to have up front, maybe even before journals and then journals. But book chapters can go a little bit down the line because they are competitive. They have been selected by someone to go in a book collection, but they're not as rigorously peer reviewed in most cases, or viewed as rigorously peer reviewed as the journal articles might. So definitely having the journal articles first and then the chapters second would make sense in your publication side. With the conferences, I tend to recommend starting with conference presentations that have been competitively selected and putting them again in APA order with respect to including the division where they've gone and the outlet where you've presented those. If they've been full-length research papers, I've grouped those separately. So start with the full-length peer-reviewed research papers and then follow it up with posters that you may have had, and then any kind of presentations and workshops that you may have given or attended. I've included, as a side note, things where you've attended certain kinds of workshops and just been a presenter in those as well, but in a separate category. So that basically is done because I feel like that gives a narrative of, again, who I have and what kind of efforts I've been making throughout my career. So it makes sense to have those there in below the conferences, not right up front, but definitely not excluding them from the CV. Items that are in submission, those. If you're a PhD on the market, I would say if you've got conference papers in submission, note that they're under review. If you're a mid-career professional, I tend to take away the things that are under submission, especially for conferences. They seem like they're just filling up certain lines. So it depends on how much emphasis you want to give to things that are just being considered, and people want to see what's coming in the pipeline for you. So with new PhDs, people want to see, if you especially looking at a department, they want to see by next year what are you going to be presenting, and if you've got something on the pipeline coming through. But if your research trajectory is very well established already, or people recognize it for its merits where you stand, you may not. It seems like a little bit of extraneous information to say that these are another 3 papers going to this conference and they're being reviewed. So there's a slight amount of juggling that goes on in your mentally in thinking and evaluating how to best tell this story. And I'm trying to present those considerations here with respect to how they might be evaluated at whichever stage you're in. And keeping in mind that you're applying for either a promotion or a job in the future. So in press articles, those definitely should be in because those are things that are going to be out and they're future publications, so they're going to be validated and they're there and they're going to be there, and people need to see that coming in for sure. So in press, in fact, are things that I would put even before I put in the journal articles that are already published. So in here, there's a lot of information that you juggle with, keeping in mind how it's going to be read, things that don't get missed out by search committees, and things that don't seem like you are emphasizing criteria, which people are not. They may not be looking at as being as important as you may be presenting them out to be. So balancing the importance in the hands of an evaluating search committee, for example, or a promotion committee, along with how you feel your efforts for those in those directions are best represented. So there's these are the tensions that play into showing where you're going as a unique individual and your trajectory and the efforts you've made. balancing how many of them have been successful, how many are underway, how many are coming along the pipeline, and how many, in some cases like with external grants, bear being told even though they were not successful. So that's some of the comments on the research direction. The third part here, I had some notes here for the mid-level career people, and these are personal notes from where I struggle. I'm 10 years out of my grad program, and one of the things that starts to seem challenging as soon as you get into your first job and moving down the line is how do you keep track of all your efforts? And some things keep making it into your CV, but the others are going to happen, but they don't deserve or they don't merit a place in a CV that's public facing, let's say for your evaluation committees at the end of the year, for grants and other places. And yet it's easy to start to forget those efforts when time comes to start to evaluate them. It's easy to forget where you were, what kinds of things you had been involved in, and what your role was, and how they fared, unless they reach some kind of a conclusion. I found myself in my first year going back to my emails and searching publication, research, journal, and then seeing what all came up from July to December, and then going back to my CV and putting it down. Finally, I decided that was not a good way of going about it. And as soon as something was submitted, as soon as I even thought of an idea, I made a note on a CV. I labeled that CV as a master document. Label it what you like. Just say, just for me, private, or a master list of everything in the pipeline, anything that cues you into what's happening with that. And include all the little things that might eventually come to something, but that you can easily forget in there. It could be a job that you're applying for, but it also could be a promotion. It could be a minor grant where that little item which didn't make sense in another context might make sense to present. So it's good to keep track of those things. And in there, you can put something like ResearchGate style, projects under development, where they're going, what kinds of journals you're thinking of sending them to, where are they in the current stage of things, have you collected data for them already? I go to pretty minute detail on that inward-facing CV with that. It just helps me keep track by the end of the day on what's going on with the CV. The next aspect is on teaching. And teaching tends to be a bit of a quandary as well. Here, the bigger constraints are to think in terms of how do you tell the story of your efforts, especially because they flow chronologically. So you're teaching by semester, and there are certain courses you're offering. They also tend to reveal your expertise with relationship to your research. So how is that flowing with respect to the courses you've been teaching and how you've begun to develop them? And lastly, if you're even applying for jobs, then how do they address the job's concerns and the requirements in the job? So keeping these three, four kind of different varying criteria in mind, your teaching CV or the teaching element can vary. You might even have 3-4 drafts of your CV. Think if there's a search position you're applying for which is looking for very specific, let's say, strategic communication courses, I would suggest organizing your teaching section by content and saying these are the strategic communication courses I've taught, but then within that to say which institution and what level they were and what they were titled. Those things then help people in search committees not miss out, especially when search committees are in a bit of a rush, not miss out on saying, oh, I think this person doesn't have that teaching in their record, or they taught it as a grad student, but not as in a fully responsible way. So putting down what you're teaching with respect to the institution you're a part of, the course you've done, and what content you've had, organizing it under content subheading would help you portray that. On the other hand, you may want to portray your development as in the career trajectory and bring that to the forefront, in which case you might highlight it just by your trajectory. You might say teach courses taught as a grad student, courses taught as on your tenure track, or courses taught as a full professor. That makes some sense maybe in that argument. I would start to think in terms of maybe timeline only if it really highlights some sort of a meaningful element in that story. Otherwise, content is a safe way to go because it helps search committees not miss out on various elements in your portfolio. The other part in teaching that people are very interested in seeing is your curriculum development efforts. So if you've been a part of any kind of course development committee, or in terms of like helping develop a new course or a new minor or any kind of aspects within the course, teaching in the teaching area, those are very highly valued. And they're like your research papers in draft, and you would really want to have those in your record in some way. So if you've created courses, if you've created a minor, if you're in the process of thinking of one too, and it's offered as a special elective right now, I would definitely be putting that in. The other aspect that gets missed out, but people are very interested in search committees, is the innovation aspect. So if there are courses where you have especially taught in experimental formats, you've done an online course, you might highlight that category. You might say online courses, hybrid courses, or flipped courses, and that is interesting to committees as well. So those are the aspects for the teaching category here. And by these, think in terms of your target audience, and think in terms of what elements of the story should come in focus for you for that target audience as you organize these. The last one here is service. I want to say it's the last one, but please don't take this as the last but the least. It is not. Service is, typically I have grad students when we are who are on the market, and if we are interviewing them or having a Skype call with them, and you ask them, well, what about your service has been most appealing to you? And most grad students will be, well, could you describe service a little bit more? And that's very understandable, but it's an opportunity to shine. It's an opportunity in a competitive job market to distinguish yourself from others where you might have similar research and teaching credentials, because it shows things you've done above and beyond. Everybody gets it that research is, publications, everyone is striving for them, and we put in 100% there. We put in 100% for teaching, but someone who's also putting in 100%, or if not 100%, let's say at least 20-25% towards efforts that do not have a direct payback in terms of research and teaching, those are they really help you. They really help you make a case for yourself. When I say that, I want to say that service really falls in this very unique category, which can speak towards your research as well. It can speak towards your teaching as well. So start thinking about service as it complements your research and teaching, and very importantly, how it can target your institutional goals of the place that you're applying to, assuming you're going for a search on a search with this one. In that case, and I can elaborate just a little bit with the service element here, when you're thinking about the institution you're applying to and you see certain centers that you like in there and that speak towards your research, you might want to see if you've done any service with respect to, when you're thinking about service, you're thinking in terms of if you've had class projects or if you've taught courses in that area, and let's say your students were involved in doing community work with that, so service learning. Or if they were involved with engaging with community members and they actually made an impact with that, I tend to list that under service as well in some ways. If you've spoken in any community organizations with respect to, let's say if your research is in health and you spoke with some local community organization, or you met with a local group and you had a talk there, even if it was for your research goals, those are excellent things to highlight under service, because they show you've made an effort to do an outreach for the community. Other ways service you can think about, so formally, would be towards your profession, towards your university, and towards your department. So in your profession would be the typical things most grad students will engage with, such as conference reviews, journal reviews that you might volunteer for, and those are excellent things. Chairing, responding at conferences, excellent, so put them all down. Again, the table format works well here, and as soon as you apply for those, put them down. Each one of them may not merit a separate year, but you could say, for example, NCA, Health Communication Division, 2015, 16, 17, I was a respondent. 2018, 18, 19, 20, I was, well, 20 is coming, I was a chair in these divisions, and then go by division. So those going by division would help people in your search committee see your affiliation with your research as well. With respect to university, if you're involved in efforts that are related to governance, they stand out, make a note of that. Service tends to go under your radar because unless you don't make a note of it, a lot of the small things you're doing, they don't get acknowledged, recognized, or even recognized by you for your efforts that you're putting into that and how they're speaking to your teaching and research. So having your service put down as soon as you are engaging in that, have it in your master document. You can go back later, shift through it and say, I need this to go for my search committee, I need this to go for my tenure, I need this to go for my annual self-evaluation, and I do not want this to go yet. But have it there. Accounting for service is something we all forget to do all too often, and it helps. In doing so, think about how it speaks towards your teaching, how it speaks towards your research, how it speaks towards your commitment to the discipline, to the university, and to your department. Any engagements in your department which you've done with respect to committees and student committees, student groups, any kind of departmental affairs, they are all very helpful to note. In fact, these three subheadings really make sense for search committees to see too, what you're doing with your profession, what you're doing at a university level, what you're doing at a department level. I think as I'm here speaking that I should have had a community too. It would have made the slide very scrunchy, but community would be very valuable. I usually always make a note of that on my rough CVs. I'm going to move to the last bit, which is it is not titled post matter, just to be clear here. That heading is usually additional information, or you could even skip that as a main heading and just include these three elements as they come up in your resume or in your CV. So if you have references and it's going for a search committee, this is where they would come in. Languages, if you have proficiency in any language additional beyond English, that's a good time to make a note of it, along with your level of proficiency in that language. Professional experience, and this is different from your first page main heading on appointments. This is experience you may have had in the industry, which doesn't directly maybe resonate with your academic career in search committee and promotion kind of way, but speaks towards your background and expertise and how it has connected with the larger world as a whole. So that comes under post matter, and anything else that you may see that speaks towards who you are, if is not in this category so far, you might include it. Consider including it here, keeping the larger narrative in mind. So think again about, as you look at balancing all these categories, think about your CV as your story of where you're planning to reach and how you're heading there. But it's also at the same time a story of who you are in the present and who it's speaking to. If you're a mid-career person, then it speaks to where you're trying to go, and if whichever ways your next future holds for you, it gives a comment on your aspirations, goals, and it also speaks towards how you might be valuable to the individuals or the organizations that the target audience that your CV is going towards. So these are a couple of considerations to keep in mind as you think about your narrative and what comes into focus and what stays a little bit out of focus for specific audiences, and how to keep a tally of all that you've been up to. With that, I'm going to hold a pause here. But if you have any questions for me with respect to where your particular goals and challenges or efforts might fit, I'm happy to take any questions on that.